Okay, okay. I need you to stop whatever you are doing right now. Put down the phone. Pause the other video. Tell whoever's in the room with you to be quiet for a second, because the story I am about to tell you is one of the most absolutely unhinged, jaw-dropping, legally catastrophic mistakes a homeowners association has ever made in the history of suburbia. And trust me, I've covered a lot of HOA stories on this channel. This one is different. This one made me laugh, gasp, and slam my hand on my desk at 3 o'clock in the morning when I was researching it. Here is the headline, and I wanted to sink in slowly. An HOA, a homeowners association, a group of neighbors supposedly elected to maintain community standards, decided, on their own, without asking, without warning, without so much as a sticky note on the door, to paint a resident's house. A house that was not theirs. A house that belonged to a real human being who had a real opinion about what color their home should be. They just did it. Showed up one Tuesday morning with rollers and brushes and a can of paint that I can only describe as the color of sadness and bureaucracy. And they went to work. And they genuinely, truly believed that there would be no consequences. Oh, sweet summer fools. Stay with me for the next 30+ minutes, because I'm going to walk you through every single detail of this story. The backstory, the drama, the legal chess match, the absolutely glorious revenge, and a moment where the HOA realized far too late that they had made the single worst decision of their organized little lives. We've got receipts. We've got plot twists. We got a villain arc for the ages and a protagonist who, by the end of this story, I would genuinely vote for public office. Let's go. So first, we need to set the scene. And I mean really set it, because context matters here. The neighborhood where all of this went down, we're going to call it Pinecrest Commons. Because I'm protecting some identities, but also because it sounds exactly like the kind of place this story would happen, is one of those master-planned suburban communities in the southeastern United States. You know the type. Built sometime in the early 2000s during that great American explosion of beige. Every house vaguely similar. Neat little lawns. Mailboxes that match. A community pool that's somehow always under maintenance whenever the actual summer heat hits. A newsletter. Of course, there's a newsletter. Now, Pinecrest Commons has been governed by its HOA, the Pinecrest Commons Community Association, or PCCA, for over 20 years. And for most of that time, the PCCA was, by most accounts, relatively fine. Mildly annoying the way all HOAs are mildly annoying, sure. The occasional passive-aggressive letter about lawn height. A strongly worded email about holiday decorations being up past January 15th. Normal suburban governance stuff that you either tolerate or you don't, depending on your personality type. But then something shifted, and it shifted because of one man. His name, and again, we're working with composites and aliases here, was Gerald Hutchins. Gerald was 63 years old, recently retired from a career in mid-level insurance management, and he had, in his retirement, discovered the one thing that retirement should never be allowed to introduce people to: unlimited free time combined with a thirst for authority. Gerald had been on the PCCA board for 4 years, had been elected HOA president 2 years ago, and in that time had transformed the community association from a low-key administrative body into what one resident described to me as, and I'm quoting here, a petty dictatorship with a laminator. Gerald had new rules. Gerald had forms. Gerald had a system. Under Gerald's leadership, the PCCA had updated its Architectural Review Committee guidelines, added 17 new line items to the Community Standards document, and had begun issuing violation notices at a rate that, according to one board member who later resigned in protest, had increased by over 400%. 400%. Gerald loved the rules. More importantly, Gerald loved enforcing the rules. He had a specific, almost artistic joy in the enforcement process. The letters, the fines, the follow-up letters, the escalation procedures. He printed things. He filed things. He had a binder system that his wife had once referred to as honestly a little scary. And when Gerald turned his attention to a particular property or a particular homeowner, he did not stop until resolution was achieved. Where resolution meant the homeowner complying completely and Gerald feeling the warm glow of bureaucratic victory. And then Gerald turned his attention to Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was 41 years old, a software engineer who worked remotely, and had purchased his home in Pinecrest Commons about 5 years before all of this went down. He'd moved there because it was a good school district. The commute for the days he used to go into an office had been reasonable, and honestly, the neighborhood looked nice. He wasn't someone who paid a lot of attention to HOA politics. He paid his dues. He kept his grass cut. He wasn't trying to make enemies or start fights. He just, and this is the part that becomes critically important, he loved his house. Not in a performative way, not in a flag out front, seasonal wreath on the door kind of way, although there was occasionally a wreath. He loved it in the quiet, private, this is my space and worked hard for it way. He had renovated the kitchen himself over 2 summers. He had replanted the entire front garden from scratch after the previous owners left it looking like a parking lot. He had, the summer before the incident, repainted his house. Now here is where we get into the details that matter. With the certainty of a man who has memorized all 32 approved colors, that Ashwood slate was not among them. Gerald went home, opened his binder, and started writing. The first letter arrived about 3 weeks after Marcus finished the paint job. It was a formal violation notice from the PCCA informing Marcus that his exterior paint color was in violation of Section 7, Subsection 4 of the governing documents. Specifically, the Architectural Review Committee approved exterior color guidelines addendum, and that he was required to correct the violation within 60 days or face fines of $25 per day. Marcus read this letter, and his first reaction, by his own account, was genuine confusion. He called the HOA management company. The PCCA contracted with a third-party management firm, as many HOAs do, and asked to speak with someone about the letter. The woman he spoke with was apologetic but firm. Yes, the color was a violation. Yes, he needed to change it. No, there wasn't a lot of wiggle room on this. Marcus asked if he could submit the color for review and potential approval. The woman said yes, the Architectural Review Committee could consider new colors. He just needed to submit a formal request along with a paint sample, a completed ARC application Form 7B, a description of the proposed color scheme, and a $40 application fee. Marcus, because he is a reasonable human being, did exactly that. He filled out the form. He provided a paint sample. He paid the $40. He submitted it and waited. 6 weeks later, 6 weeks, during which the 60-day correction window was still theoretically running, he received a response. The Architectural Review Committee had reviewed his submission and denied it. The color did not align with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards as defined in the ARC guidelines. He was welcome to resubmit with a color from the approved palette. Marcus stared at this letter for a long time. Now here is the thing. Here is the thing that I need you to understand about the position Marcus was in at this point. Repainting a house, even just the exterior, is not a trivial undertaking. It costs money, not a little money. Depending on the size of the house, the complexity of the architecture, the quality of the paint, you're looking at several $1,000s minimum. Marcus had just spent that money. Not 2 months ago, he had looked at swatches for 3 weeks, hired a painter, paid for premium exterior paint, and had a job done that he was genuinely proud of. And now he was being told that he needed to do it all over again, this time in one of 32 pre-approved colors, most of which he described as various shades of beige with 2 accents that can only be described as old Band-Aid. He was frustrated. He was more than frustrated. He was deeply, quietly, specifically annoyed in the way that only someone who has been told their tasteful, inoffensive, legitimate aesthetic choice is wrong can be annoyed. But he was also, at this point, still trying to be reasonable. He wrote back to the HOA. He pointed out that the ARC guidelines addendum had not been included in his disclosure documents at the time of purchase. He noted that he had not been informed of the color requirement before painting. He asked whether there was any accommodation or grandfather provision for homeowners who had made improvements in good faith without access to the required documentation. He got a form letter back. We understand your concerns. The governing documents are the governing documents. The violation stands. Compliance is required within 30 days or daily fines will begin. 30 days, not 60 anymore. The 60-day window had apparently been running this whole time, and between the ARC submission period and the review and the back and forth, it had nearly elapsed. Marcus was now looking at a 30-day countdown before daily fines kicked in. So Marcus did what any self-respecting person in this situation does. He got on the internet. I need to take a quick pause here to acknowledge something, because it's going to become very important later in the story. Marcus Webb, before he became the main character in this HOA saga, was a software engineer. He was specifically a software engineer with a professional history that included, among other things, several years working on compliance and documentation systems for a mid-sized tech company. He knew how to read technical documents. He knew how to find inconsistencies. He knew how to build a paper trail. He knew, perhaps most importantly, how to research. When Marcus went on the internet, he wasn't just looking for emotional validation on Reddit, although he found plenty of that, and frankly, he deserved it. He was looking for information, legal information. Specifically, he started reading his state statutes governing homeowners associations. And what he found there was very, very interesting. He found that under his state's HOA laws, there were specific requirements around disclosure. Specifically, that governing documents, including all addenda and guidelines, were required to be made available to prospective buyers as part of the purchase process, and that HOAs had certain obligations around notifying homeowners of new or updated rules before enforcing them. He also found that his state had statutes governing HOA fines, specifically around what constituted a proper notice and opportunity to cure a violation before fines could begin accruing. He found something else, too. Something small. Something that seemed like a technicality at first, but would turn out to be much more than that. The PCCA's governing documents, the ones he finally paid $35 to obtain because he was building a file now and he needed the actual documents, contained a provision about how the approved color palette could be updated. It required a formal vote of the full HOA board, with notice given to homeowners 30 days in advance and minutes recorded. The current color palette, the one Marcus's paint color allegedly violated, had been updated 18 months ago. Marcus pulled the board meeting minutes for that period. The minutes were incomplete. The vote to update the color palette was recorded, but the required 30-day advance notice to homeowners, there was no documentation of it. No record of a newsletter announcement, no email blast, no posted notice. Nothing. Marcus leaned back in his chair and stared at his ceiling for a long moment. Then he called a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Denise Carver, and she was a real estate attorney with specific experience in HOA law. Marcus found her through a local bar association referral and called her on a Thursday afternoon with what he thought was going to be a 30-minute consultation. It turned into 2.5 hours. Denise Carver listened to the whole story. The undisclosed addendum. The $40 application fee for a review that took 6 weeks. The shrinking window. The form letter responses. And then she looked at the documentation Marcus had gathered, including the board meeting minutes. And she got very quiet for a moment in the way that lawyers get quiet when they see something that is simultaneously terrible and interesting. "Mr. Webb," she said, and Marcus told me he will never forget this moment, "I think you may have significantly more leverage than you realize." She explained the issues she saw. The disclosure failure at purchase, potentially actionable. The procedural irregularity around the color palette update, potentially invalidating the rule itself. The timeline around the fines, potentially improper under state statute. Each of these things, individually, might have been a speed bump. Together, they formed something that looked a lot like a pattern of procedural failure that had real legal consequences. She recommended a specific course of action. First, send a formal legal response to the HOA, not through the management company, but directly to the PCCA board, outlining these issues and requesting a 90-day stay on any fines while the discrepancies were reviewed. Second, file a formal complaint with the state agency that oversees HOA disputes. Third, begin formally documenting everything. Every communication, every letter, every phone call, date stamped and organized. Marcus agreed to all of it. He paid the retainer. He was in. The legal letter went out 2 weeks later. It was 8 pages long. It cited specific state statutes. It outlined the disclosure failure, the procedural irregularity, and the fine timeline issue. It requested, formally and in writing, a 30-day hold on all enforcement actions while these matters were reviewed by the board. It also included, and this is the part that I love, a very politely worded section noting that Marcus was now in the process of requesting records, meeting minutes, financial statements, the full communication history, under his rights as a homeowner under state law. Not threatening, just informative, just letting them know he was looking. Gerald received this letter. And here is where Gerald made his first catastrophically bad decision. Instead of pausing, consulting with the HOA's attorney, and responding through proper channels, Gerald called a board meeting, an informal one, without proper notice to the full membership, which would later be its own problem, and decided that the response to Marcus's legal letter was going to be aggressive forward movement. In Gerald's mind, this was a bluff. This was a homeowner who'd gotten a little lawyer happy and was trying to intimidate the board into letting him keep his non-compliant paint color. Gerald had seen this before, or thought he had. He'd had homeowners push back before, and they'd always eventually back down, because the HOA had resources and processes and the weight of the governing documents behind it, and individual homeowners usually didn't want the fight. Gerald did not fully appreciate that Marcus was different. Marcus had documentation. Marcus had a lawyer who had specifically described his position as having significant leverage. And Marcus had the particular quality that makes someone genuinely dangerous in a bureaucratic dispute, which is that he was not emotionally reactive. He was patient, he was methodical, and he was, as we are about to see, absolutely not going anywhere. So Gerald decided to escalate. The board voted, again in this informal meeting, again with questionable procedural validity, to move Marcus to the maximum fine schedule, which was $100 per day, effective immediately. They sent him a new notice, $100 per day. They wanted the paint changed. They were not backing down. Marcus received this notice, forwarded it to Denise, and said 3 words, add it to the file. The state HOA dispute complaint was filed. The records requests went in. Marcus started keeping a literal log, a spreadsheet, because he was a software engineer, and of course it was a spreadsheet of every interaction, date, time, medium, summary, attached documentation. He was building a case like you build software, methodically, version controlled. Now here's where the story takes its first big twist, and I want you to buckle up a little bit, because this is where it gets genuinely interesting. About 6 weeks into this standoff, fines supposedly accruing, lawyer letters flying back and forth, records requests being processed, Marcus was talking to his next-door neighbor, a woman named Patricia, who had lived in the neighborhood for 12 years. They were talking over the fence the way neighbors do, and Marcus mentioned the ongoing situation, and Patricia got a very specific look on her face. "Oh, Gerald," she said, in a tone that contained the full weight of 12 years of experience. And then Patricia said something that changed everything. She said, "You know, he did the same thing to the Hendersons on Oakmore Drive, right? About 2 years ago." Marcus did not know this. He asked Patricia to tell him more. The short version, 2 years ago, a family, the Hendersons, had made a similar exterior modification that was allegedly non-compliant. They'd received the same escalating letter campaign from Gerald, and they had eventually complied, repainted their house in an approved color, and paid a portion of the fines that had accrued during the dispute. They hadn't fought it. They'd just eventually given up and done what Gerald wanted. But here was the important detail. Patricia said that during the Henderson situation, she distinctly remembered Gerald at a board meeting saying something about how the board had authority to make corrections at the homeowner's expense if a homeowner failed to comply after a certain period. Marcus went very still when he heard this. "Say that again," he said. Patricia repeated it. Gerald had said, in a board meeting, that the HOA had authority to make corrections at the homeowner's expense. Marcus went inside, opened his laptop, and started reading the governing documents again. All of them. Every page. Every footnote. And there it was, buried in Section 11. The section about HOA enforcement powers. A clause that said the association could, after proper notice and a specified non-compliance period, arrange for the correction of violations and charge the cost to the homeowner, collectible as additional assessments. It was vague. It was badly written. It had probably been intended for things like overgrown lawns or broken fences, situations where a homeowner was genuinely absent or incapacitated and the neighborhood eyesore needed addressing. It had almost certainly not been intended to authorize the HOA to hire someone to paint a perfectly functional house that just happened to be the wrong color. But Gerald was going to try to use it. Marcus called Denise immediately. He told her about the clause. He told her about what Patricia had said. He told her that he genuinely believed Gerald was planning to show up and repaint his house. Denise was quiet for a moment. "If they do that," she said slowly, "they will have made a very significant error." "How significant?" Marcus asked. "Depending on how it's handled, potentially the kind of error that doesn't just resolve your dispute, the kind that results in damages." Marcus sat with that for a moment, and then he made a decision that I can only describe as beautiful in its strategic clarity. He did not warn Gerald. He did not call the HOA and say, "Please don't do this." He did not file an emergency injunction, although Denise told him that was an option. He waited. He set up a security camera. Well, he had a security camera already, a video doorbell, and 2 side-mounted cameras, because he was a sensible homeowner with an eye for security. He made sure they were all working, all recording, all time-stamped. He made sure his cloud backup was active. And then he waited. And on a Tuesday morning in October, about 2 months into the dispute, Marcus looked at his phone and saw a notification from his doorbell camera. He was at his desk working. He opened the app. There was a truck in front of his house. A painting contractor's truck. 2 men were getting out with ladders, paint cans, and roller brushes. Marcus took a screenshot. He let it run for 30 more seconds to get good footage of the truck, including the license plate and the company name on the side, and then he called Denise. "They're here," he said. "Okay," said Denise, completely calm. "Let them paint. I want to pause here for a second because I know some of you are screaming at you. Let them paint. Let them paint your house." And I understand that reaction. I genuinely do. There is something viscerally horrifying about watching strangers paint your house a color you didn't choose. But here's what Marcus understood, and what Denise understood, and what Gerald absolutely did not understand. The moment that truck showed up and those painters touched Marcus's house without his permission, the entire dynamic of this dispute changed permanently. Because up until that moment, this was a dispute about a paint color and some procedurally questionable fines. The moment they painted that house, it became something else entirely. It became property damage. It became trespass. It became the kind of thing that opens up the possibility of actual, meaningful, legally significant damages. Marcus watched his house get painted through his phone camera from his home office with the focused calm of a man who has already won. He called his phone. He kept the call going while the painting happened. His wife, they'd been together for 11 years, and she had been wonderfully, fiercely supportive throughout this entire ordeal, sat next to him and watched the feed. When the painters finished, 3.5 hours, his whole house, painted a color that he would later describe in legal documents as an uninvited shade of grayish. She looked at him and said, simply, "Okay, now burn it all down." She didn't mean literally. She meant legally. And no, did he. The formal complaint was updated that same day. The security camera footage, all 3.5 hours of it from 3 angles, time-stamped, was downloaded, backed up in 3 separate locations, and sent to Denise. Marcus also took extensive photos of the finished paint job, documenting the color, the overspray on his trim, the slight inconsistency in coverage near the garage where the painters had rushed a little, and the fact that in 2 places they had painted over a section of decorative stonework that was never supposed to be painted. He documented everything with the thoroughness of a man who has been preparing for this moment. Then Marcus went to his front door, opened it, and looked at his house, painted a color he did not choose, that no one had asked him about, and took a single long breath. Then he went back inside and got to work. Denise filed an amended complaint with the state HOA oversight agency within 48 hours. She also filed a civil complaint in circuit court on the following grounds. Trespass. The HOA and its contractors had physically entered and altered Marcus's property without consent. Property damage. They had altered the appearance of his property without authorization and done so improperly, including the painting over of stonework. Violation of HOA governing statute. The enforcement mechanism they'd used was procedurally invalid given the outstanding legal disputes. Violation of due process under the HOA's own governing documents, the informal board meeting, the improper notice, the aggressive fine escalation. The total in claimed damages, actual damages plus statutory damages available under state HOA law for procedural violations, came to just over $60,000. Gerald, when he received the civil complaint, allegedly said, according to someone present at the time, "This is ridiculous. They can't do this." His board members looked at each other. One of them, apparently, already had a call into a lawyer. Now the story has a subplot, and I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't get into it, because this subplot is honestly almost as satisfying as the main story. Remember Patricia, the neighbor who told Marcus about the Hendersons? Well, Marcus's situation had apparently been the talk of the neighborhood for a while, because nothing spreads through a suburban HOA community faster than a good conflict, and Patricia had been keeping Marcus updated on the various reactions within the community. Some people thought Marcus should just comply and move on. Some people were privately thrilled that someone was finally pushing back. And some people, a small but growing group, had started coming to Marcus with their own grievances. Because here's the thing about Gerald and his reign of the PCCA. While Marcus had been the most publicly prominent target, he was far from the only one. There was a couple on the south side of the development who had received 17 violation notices over 3 years for various infractions, including one for having a basketball hoop in their driveway, which they used with their children every weekend. There was a retired teacher who had been fined for having a garden ornament that Gerald had personally decided was decorative clutter under an extremely broad interpretation of a community aesthetics guideline. There was a small business owner who had received repeated letters about the commercial vehicle, his work van, being parked in his own driveway, even though the governing documents only prohibited commercial vehicles from being parked on common streets. One by one, these neighbors started showing up, not physically, or well, some of them physically, because Marcus had started hosting informal gatherings on his front porch to talk about the situation, gatherings that Gerald apparently found deeply suspicious and that he once described in an email to the management company as an organized campaign of destabilization, which is such an incredible phrase for a man to use about his neighbors having iced tea on a porch. Marcus collected their stories. He collected their documentation. Denise reviewed them and identified several as having their own legal issues. And Marcus started quietly helping them organize. He built a shared drive, a shared folder with all the relevant legal statutes, template letters, guidance documents. He shared it with anyone who asked. He was not leading a revolution. He was sharing information. But information, in this kind of situation, is everything. Gerald's informal board began to fracture. One board member, the one who had already called a lawyer, resigned from the board entirely about 3 weeks after the civil complaint was filed, citing irreconcilable differences in approach. Another board member stopped showing up to meetings. The management company, which had a professional liability interest in not being associated with a lawsuit, began communicating much more carefully and started, very noticeably, declining to take any action on ongoing enforcement matters pending legal review. The HOA was rudderless. Gerald was still at the helm, but the ship had stopped responding to his commands. The mediation process took about 6 weeks. Denise was in favor of going to mediation before going to full trial, partly because the damages were real, but partly because mediation was often where HOAs, when confronted with the full picture of their procedural failures, decided to be sensible. She had correctly read the situation. The HOA's attorney, an outside counsel they brought in, because even Gerald understood by now that this was serious, had clearly told him the same thing Denise had told Marcus, which was that the procedural irregularities were significant and the painting without consent was a real problem. Because in that mediation session, Gerald did not come in swinging. Gerald came in looking, for the first time in this story, a little bit scared. Marcus came in with Denise on one side and 60 pages of documentation on the other. He came in with time-stamped camera footage. He came in with the records he'd obtained through his homeowner's rights requests, which had turned up more procedural inconsistencies than he'd even anticipated. He came in calm. He came in prepared. The settlement negotiation took one full day. I'm not going to tell you the exact dollar figure, because Marcus asked for that to remain confidential, but I will tell you what I know. The HOA agreed to repaint Marcus's house, this time an ashwood slate, his original color, the color of his choosing, at their expense, using a qualified contractor of Marcus's selection. They agreed to a financial settlement that covered Marcus's legal fees, his original paint job costs, and additional damages. They agreed to formally waive all fines that had been levied during the dispute period. They agreed to send written acknowledgement to Marcus that the color restriction had not been properly disclosed at the time of purchase. And this is the one that made me actually gasp when I read it. They agreed to a full procedural audit of the PCCA's enforcement practices over the past 3 years, conducted by a neutral third party, with the results to be shared with all homeowners in the community. Every homeowner, the full membership. The audit results were going out to everyone. Gerald was at that mediation. He signed the agreement. He is reported to have been very quiet for most of the afternoon. The audit took 3 months. The results came out in January. They went to every homeowner in Pinecrest Commons in a letter that Marcus did not write, but that he read approximately 4 times. The audit found numerous procedural irregularities in the enforcement process, including improper fine escalation, violations of the HOA's own notice requirements, and a number of fines and assessments levied during the prior 2 years that were recommended for review and potential refund. The couple on the south side with the basketball hoop, they got a check. The retired teacher with the garden ornament, the violation was officially declared invalid. The small business owner, the governing documents were clarified to explicitly exempt homeowner-owned commercial vehicles parked on private driveways. Gerald resigned from the HOA board the following month, citing personal reasons. The board held a proper election, with full notice given to the community and a voting period conducted according to the governing documents. 3 new members were elected, including, and I genuinely love this, the retired teacher who had been fined for garden ornament clutter. Marcus's house was repainted in ashwood slate in March. He stood on his front lawn and watched the painters work, and this time, he wasn't watching through a security camera app. He was standing right there in the morning sun, coffee in hand, watching his house get put back exactly the way he'd wanted it in the first place. Patricia stood at her fence and watched with him for a while. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. Now I want to talk about the lessons of this story, because there are real, practical, genuinely important takeaways here beyond just the deeply satisfying narrative of a man who refused to be pushed around by a guy with a binder. The first lesson, and this is the most important one, know your governing documents before you do anything that requires HOA approval. I know. The documents are long, they're dense, they're written by lawyers for lawyers. But they're the rules you're living under, and the time to learn what's in them is before you make an expensive modification to your property, not after you've already spent the money and gotten a violation notice. If you're buying a home in an HOA, get the full governing documents as part of your due diligence. Pay the $35. Read the addenda. All of them. The second lesson, HOA power is real, but it is not unlimited, and it is not above the law. HOAs are governed by state statutes, and those statutes specify what HOAs can and cannot do, what procedures they must follow, and what rights homeowners have. In most states, homeowners have the right to inspect governing documents, attend meetings, vote on certain matters, and dispute violations through formal processes. Those rights exist for a reason. Use them. The third lesson, documentation is your most powerful tool. Marcus did not win this because he got angry. He did not win it because he yelled at anyone or made scenes or called the news. He won it because he kept records. He kept everything. Every letter, every email, every timestamp, every camera frame. When you are in a dispute, any dispute, not just with an HOA, the person with the better documentation almost always has the better position. The fourth lesson, and this one is specifically about the tactic Gerald used, the painting without consent, is one that HOA boards need to hear directly. That enforcement clause that Gerald used, the correct at homeowner's expense provision, those clauses exist in many HOA governing documents, and they can, under very specific circumstances and with very specific procedural requirements, be valid. But they're not a blank check. They do not override state law. They do not eliminate the homeowner's due process rights. And when they are misused, when they're deployed aggressively without proper notice against a homeowner who has an active legal dispute with the association, they expose the HOA to exactly the kind of liability that the PCCA walks straight into. The fifth lesson, and the one I find most interesting from a human dynamics perspective, community power matters. Marcus did not fix Pinecrest Commons by himself. He fixed it because his individual stand gave other residents the courage and the tools to raise their own concerns. The audit didn't happen because of Marcus alone. It happened because he created a shared drive with legal documents and talked to his neighbors on his front porch and treated the problem like the community problem that it actually was. HOAs are, at their core, community organizations. When they stop serving the community and start serving the ego of a retired insurance manager with a laminator, the community has both the right and the ability to correct that. Now look, I want to be fair here because this channel is always about full fairness, even when the story is as one-sided as this one largely is. HOAs, in principle, are not inherently bad. The idea behind them, neighbors pooling resources and agreeing to common standards to maintain property values and quality of life, is not a crazy idea. It works in a lot of communities. It works when boards are transparent, when rules are applied consistently and fairly, when homeowners are treated as partners rather than subjects, and when the people running things remember that the purpose of the rules is to serve the community, not the other way around. The problem is not homeowner associations as a concept. The problem is unchecked authority in the hands of people who have lost sight of what the authority is for. Gerald was not a monster. He was, in the most charitable interpretation, someone who genuinely believed in the rules and lost perspective on why the rules existed. He believed so much in the mechanism of enforcement that he forgot the mechanism was supposed to serve people, not dominate them. The system worked, eventually, because Marcus forced it to work. Because he documented everything, got legal counsel, connected with his neighbors, and refused to be worn down into compliance. Not everyone could do that. Not everyone has the time, the resources, the legal knowledge, or the psychological constitution to fight that fight. And that's honestly the most troubling part of this story. Not Gerald, but the knowledge that for every Marcus Webb who fights back and wins, there are probably 10 homeowners who just gave up and repainted their house the color of old Band-Aid because they didn't know they had other options. You have other options. That's the point. You have rights. Know them. Marcus Webb's house is, as of the last time we checked in on this story, painted ashwood slate. It looks great. He has a new front garden that he put in the spring after all of this concluded, which features, deliberately and joyfully, several garden ornaments. The retired teacher next door sent him a bottle of wine when the audit results came out. Patricia continues to be an excellent neighbor and a font of neighborhood intelligence. Gerald, as far as anyone knows, has taken up golf. This seems appropriate. Golf has rules. Golf has standards. Golf has the particular mix of structure and frustration that Gerald seems to need. We wish him well on the fairway. And the Pinecrest Commons Community Association now sends out its newsletter with a new section at the bottom, a brief summary of homeowner rights and how to access governing documents. It's not a dramatic change. It's not a monument, but it's there every month in black and white, reminding everyone that the rules belong to all of them. If you made it this far, first of all, thank you. Genuinely. This is the kind of story that I think matters, not just because it's satisfying to watch bureaucratic overreach get its comeuppance, but because these are real situations that real people face in real neighborhoods. And the more we talk about homeowner rights, HOA accountability, and the importance of documentation and community solidarity, the better prepared all of us are to handle situations like this. Drop a comment below if you've ever had an HOA situation of your own. I read every single one of them, and honestly, the comment section on HOA videos is consistently the most cathartic corner of the entire internet. Some of you have stories that absolutely need to be told, and I will be telling them. We're not done with HOA stories on this channel. Not even close. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the next story coming up is, and I cannot say too much yet, involving an HOA, a Halloween display, a noise complaint filed against a wind chime, and a man who used his background in intellectual property law in a way that no one in that neighborhood expected. That video is going to be extraordinary. And if someone you know is in an HOA situation, share this video with them. Not for the entertainment value, although there is plenty of that. Share it because there is real, practical, genuinely useful information in here that might help someone understand their rights before it's too late. Until next time, document everything. Know your rights. And whatever you do, do not let anyone paint your house without your permission. Take care of yourselves.